question I want to raise with you is whether reason has any part in determining what we ought to do, and if so, what part? The question is a very large one. Indeed, it can hardly be answered except by setting forth a complete ethical theory. Perhaps the best way to begin is to remind ourselves of the astonishing difference of opinion on the place of reason in morals to be found in our ethical tradition. Included in this tradition are two strains of thought that are not only different but opposed to each other, the Greek strain and the Christian. In the thought of the three great Greeks, to see what was right was an exercise of reason. The first essential of the good life was wisdom, an understanding of how a proposed act was related to one's own good, to the good of the community, and ultimately to the good of the world. Indeed, the real difficulty in doing what is right, Socrates said, is intellectual. For if we can only see it, we shall do it automatically. I wonder if you've ever thought about that. It's puzzled me often. Can you ever find a case of a person who sees with full clearness and conviction what he ought to do, and nevertheless doesn't do it? Socrates said you couldn't find such a case. Regarding this fluid passage of insight into action, Plato and Aristotle were less confident, but they still agreed that knowledge was the condition of goodness, that for the living of the good life the most important instrument was a practiced reason. On the other side of our ethical tradition, this emphasis on reason almost wholly disappears. The stress of the Hebrew Christian ethics is not on a clear head, but a clean heart. When the call came to condense the law and the prophets into a single word, that word was not knowledge, but love of God and love of man. Out of the heart of man, good and evil proceeded. If the inside of the cup was clean, the outside would take care of itself. The kind of wisdom prized by the Greeks, St. Paul thought a stumbling block. Not that wisdom in every sense was depreciated. Faith had its own kind of wisdom, but this was a divine gift, and neither an achievement of natural reason, nor, if recent theologians are to be followed, I'm thinking of Barth and Brunner, the insight that we have religiously is not even continuous or necessarily consistent with our own reason. Now this ancient conflict between reason and feeling has plagued the whole later development of ethics, though in different times it has taken different forms. It has broken out again in the 20th century. In the conflict between deontologists and emotivists, I think it's come to a head. I want to say something about these two great contrasting schools of thought. I've had the great privilege of working under the leaders of both these schools. The deontologists are the 20th century rationalists. Sir David Ross has put their position flatly. Now I quote from Ross, that an act, qua fulfilling a promise, or qua effecting a just distribution of good, is prima facie right, is self-evident. It is self-evident just as a mathematical axiom, or the validity of a form of inference, is self-evident. Ross does not hold, as Kant did, the strange doctrine of once right, always right. It is only the apparent or prima facie rightness of promise-keeping, for example, that is self-evident, not its rightness in a particular case, where he admits that the evil of the consequences may justify a breach of promise. But whether these consequences are themselves good or evil, and whether the duty to produce them outweighs the duty to keep a promise, are themselves matters of intellectual apprehension. That is, Ross, in my view, is an inheritor of the great Greek attitude, that ethical insight is primarily a matter of the intellect. By his masterly defense of these positions, Ross has kept the rationalist tradition vigorously alive. It may be that between the party of reason and the party of feeling, a deeper cleavage will develop than any that now appears, but I confess that I don't see how it could. The difference is flat, uncompromising, and final. Ross holds that when you say promise-keeping is right, You are asserting as true something you see to be as necessarily true as that two straight lines cannot enclose a space. The non-cognitivists, whether of the school of Ayer or Russell or Hare or Carnap, hold that far from seeing anything to be necessary, you are not even seeing anything to be true. You are, of course, conceiving or contemplating a kind of promise-keeping, but contemplating this object, you are saying something like cheers, or please do act in conformity with it. The protagonists in the ethical drama have now drawn so far apart that they have left the center of the stage invitingly open for anyone else who wants to make an entrance, which in the present case seems to mean me. One obviously cannot take sides with both these eminent parties, and I am afraid I cannot take sides very heartily with either. It would be prudent perhaps to deal with the weaker one first, so let's pay our respects at once to emotivism. You see, I conceive the present ethical field as divided between these two great protagonists, Ross and the intellectualists, Ayer and the emotivists. Now, I'm closer to Ross than I am to Ayer a good deal, but I don't think we can commit ourselves to either. I do not think the emotivists are always clear what they're trying to do. When they tell us that what X is right means, are they trying to give us, 1, what the plain man means, or 2, what the self-critical and reflective man means, or 3, what we ought to mean, whether in fact anyone does mean it or not? If it's number 1, what the plain man means, that they are offering us, we may dismiss their offering at once. For the plain man, and that means all of us outside the classroom, the plain man certainly thinks he is saying something true when he makes an ethical judgment, and I see no reason for holding that he's in the dark about this intention of his. If it is account number 3 that we are being given, namely what people ought to mean, this must signify for an emotivist either a usage that happens to arouse in him a favoring emotion, to use Ayer's strange terms, and then, if he does not feel in the same way, it would be pointless to say one ought to adopt it, or else what we ought to mean is presumably what reflective and self-critical people mean, and then we have sense number 2. Is it true, then, that self-critical people intend, when they make a moral judgment, to express attitudes only, as distinct from saying anything that is true or false? No, surely not. To put such an intention in their mouth would make it impossible for them to say many things that it seems to me quite plain that they want to say. For example, they could not in consistency say that anyone had ever been good or bad in the past, or any act right or wrong, or any experience valuable or disvaluable, or that any would ever be so in the future. If they used language that seemed to say this, they would find that they were only expressing how they felt now about something in the past or future, not reporting any character that people or actions had when they existed. They are ascribing no badness to Judas. Now, I hope that's clear. Suppose we say that Judas did a wrong or a bad act. What Mr. Ayer is saying is that we are simply expressing our present emotions about Judas's action many centuries ago. We're not really saying anything descriptively true about Judas's act when and as it was done. And that seems to me incredible. We are ascribing no wrongness to Booth's act of assassination, no value to the ecstasies of Plotinus, no evil to that future atomic destruction which we are nevertheless somehow afraid of. In speaking of past or future evil, people are expressing nothing that could not be removed merely by thinking of something else. No crime is a crime until it is discovered, and it remains a crime only so long as we have a feeling about it. I wish you'd push me on that if it isn't clear. As it seems to me that Ayer's position, the emotivist position, would justify the perfect crime. And that's a very curious kind of ethics. To offer evidence that an act is wrong, or to try to justify it by reasoning, is inept, for an exclamation can be neither proved nor disproved. In short, emotivism can be accepted only by someone who is ready to renounce the clear intentions of both plain and reflective men and substitute a meaning of his own. Well, we must leave emotivism and its more pallid linguistic legatees. I don't think that the linguistic analysts have added much to Ayer's analysis. You'll find that Mr. Hare and Mr. Noel Smith and Mr. Urmson think they've added a good deal. I don't think they have. Essentially, they're taking the emotivist position. Well, let's leave those behind for the moment and go on to an interpretation of moral judgment that does less violence to actual intention. What is this to be? Whatever it is, it must recognize that in saying X is right, I am thinking or asserting something, and not merely indulging in a private, emotional, or imperative explosion. What part, if any, does rational insight play in such a judgment? According to Sir David Ross, and I come back to him because I think he's one of the 2 or 3 greatest living moralists, it plays a very important part, and it would be well to see what this is in the sort of case Ross likes to take. Suppose I've borrowed money from a man of means and have promised to return it on a certain day. On that day, I set out with it to his home, but on the way I see a Salvation Army lass tinkling her bell appealingly and collecting for the relief of the down and out. I pause and reflect. What if I should break my promise and give the money for such relief? My creditor will not miss it. He might not even notice my default, while if I gave it to relief instead, it would alleviate real need. Which should I do? According to Rashdall, Moore, and the teleologists, I should bestow the money where it will do the greatest good. That would seem to suggest that I should give it to the Salvation Army lass and go home with a light purse and a lighter heart. Now, says Ross, that's an impossible suggestion. None of us really thinks that way or acts that way. It would probably not even occur to us to ask whether breaking our promise would produce better results than keeping it. That seems a hardly relevant question. What binds us is the past engagement, not the future consequences. If we stop to think at all, we should probably say to ourselves, I certainly do have an obligation to concern myself about people in need. I certainly also have obligations to pay my debts and keep my promises. In this case, it seems clear that these latter obligations outweigh the former one. I am more obligated to repay the loan as promised than to bestow a bounty elsewhere. Now, I think we must surely agree with Ross that this is the way we actually think in such situations. When the time comes to repay a debt or keep a promise, we don't resort to calculations of private or even public profit before deciding what we should do. We seem to see our duty in advance of any such calculations. Here the deontologists are faithful to the facts. But they go on to explain this duty in a very puzzling way. They say that the duty to keep a promise or pay a debt arises wholly out of the character of the act itself. It's not based on any good that may lie, either in the action or in its results. Strictly speaking, it is obligatory for no reason at all. Here I cannot follow. Now, from this point on, I've just left the emotivists behind. I don't think their view is credible at all. I think the choice that lies between us is the choice between Ross's position, which is a sort of modified Immanuel Kant, and the position that actions are right or wrong because of their consequences. Now, I agree that we can recognize the duty of keeping a promise without any actual reference to the goods involved. What I find it harder to admit is that when we come on reflection to justify this obligation, we can still dispense with good consequences. With his characteristic fairness, Ross concedes that if the evils entailed by breaking a promise grow great enough, the promise should be broken. No one except possibly Kant, in one of his darker moments, would say that if a man's keeping his promise would make it impossible for him to buy medicines needed to save his child's life, he should keep his word and let the child go. It is therefore possible to weigh the obligation to keep a promise against the obligation to produce good. But there's a strange difference between the two obligations. When we are considering only the duty to produce good, the obligation rises and falls with the amount of good involved. On the other hand, the obligation to keep promises may rise and fall without any regard to such good. And when we weigh the two types of obligation against each other, the procedure is very odd. The good in one pan rises and falls, while that in the other remains steady at zero. Yet the pan in which there is no good may keep increasing in weight till it far outweighs the other. Now, there's nothing self-contradictory in such a view. It may be that there are different kinds of reason for actions being obligatory, or that some duties have reasons and others not. I can only say that this seems to me less likely than the view that all our duties have grounds, that these grounds will be found in all cases to be what deontologists admit to be the ground in many or most cases, namely the good involved, and that when we weigh our duties against each other, it is on this single scale that we do so. That is, I am committed wholeheartedly to the teleological or consequences view. The objective rightness of an action always depends, I think, upon whether or not it produces the greatest amount of good. If it does, the action is right. If it doesn't, it's wrong. Now, one knows what the deontologists will reply. It is their main point that we ought at times to take one course rather than another, even when no greater good seems to be involved. We must therefore show that this is more than a seeming, that a greater good really is involved. This I think we can do. But in doing so, we must make one large concession. If we take our particular act of promise-keeping out of the framework of further practices that it implies and weigh its results thus taken in isolation against those of the generous act taken also in isolation, we shall never make out our case. It seems mere sophistry to argue that the receipt by a man of means of money that he would not miss involves a greater good than the relief of pressing need. Is there any further and unnoted good involved in repaying the debt? Now, the old utilitarians like John Stuart Mill and even G.E. Moore used to maintain that the rightness or wrongness of an act depended upon the consequences of that act taken in isolation from anything else. Suppose, for example, I did have to decide whether to give my money to the Salvation Army or to pay a debt with it. On their theory, I should do whatever would produce the greatest good. In this case, it seems quite clear that I ought to give it to the Salvation Army lass and break my promise to the man with whom I had agreed to return it on a certain day. Now, if that's what these utilitarians mean, we just can't accept their position. I don't think that any of us would say that that is really what we ought to do. Now, is there any further and unnoted good involved in repaying the debt in a case of this kind? Surely there is. If the plain man who refuses to lie or break a promise were asked why he refuses, his first response might well be one of bewilderment, and his second, some such remark as, if people were to lie and break their promises, society would go to pieces. This is vague but suggestive. What is suggestive is a sense that his keeping a promise or repaying a debt is a duty that does not stand alone, that its fall would carry a great deal else with it. There's enough reason stirring in him to show that he cannot throw over these practices himself without granting a like privilege to others. The real question, as Kant saw, is whether he can approve people generally acting as he does. And the setting of his act is even wider. His keeping a promise or repaying a debt is part of a network of duties that make up his pattern of life. A challenge to any one of these he feels as a challenge to this way of life as a whole. That is why his flouting of one obligation is felt to have such widespread repercussions. If he's really free to throw off a debt, then he's free to break a promise. That's really involved. If he's free to break promises, he's free to deceive people. If he's free to disregard their interests in this way, there is no reason why he should not do it in other ways, to take their property, for example. But if he may do that, he's free to dodge his grocery bills, to cheat the government out of his taxes, to pocket the spoons of his host, fly out of military service. And if he thinks, he sees that he must in consistency grant these privileges to everyone else. But to do that would be to surrender his way of life as a whole. He can no more drop one duty without affecting other duties than he can drop an eye or a leg without affecting his organism as a whole. To accept this is to accept a broadened teleological ethics. H.W.B. Joseph, an old teacher of mine, and John Rawls in this country have reminded us that the consequences to which utilitarians in the past have appealed have been too narrow, those of the isolated act rather than of the fabric of actions with which this one is bound up. Professor Rawls uses, more happily perhaps than Wittgenstein, the analogy of playing a game. When Casey goes to the bat, he's not free to take 4 strikes or to gather daisies. By going to the plate, he has committed himself to the game as a whole, with all its rules. If he insists on 4 strikes just this once, or a pause between bases to gather daisies, the coach and the umpire would display imperfect sympathies toward him. If he is to play the game, he cannot pick and choose among its rules. In the same way, the keeping of promises and the paying of debts are rules of a game of honor, which we and our fellows are playing with each other. And if each person were free to suspend a rule when he felt like it, the result would not be a minor inconvenience merely, the game as a whole would be wrecked. For the keeping of particular rules, then, there is a very strong rational ground. That ground is that this rule belongs to a network of rules which must be obeyed as a whole if our way of life is to be maintained. So I've now reached the point where I'm rejecting both the emotivists with Mr. Ayer and the deontologists with Mr. Ross. And I am taking the view that rightness or wrongness of action must be determined by reference to the consequences. But now clearly this is not the end of the road. Why should one way of life be maintained rather than another? My own answer to that, for what it is worth, is simple. The only rational defense of a way of life, of asceticism or Epicureanism or Christianity, lies in showing that it produces the largest good. But now, what does one mean by good? That's the next point, and it's an all-important one. We must creep up warily on this notoriously treacherous term. It is easier to illustrate goods than to define good. Among the goods of life, we should include happiness, health, books and music, and education, an ample income, and friends. This is a miscellaneous lot which needs inspection. Some of these things, books and an income, for example, are plainly instrumental goods, valued as means to others that are intrinsic. So we may confine ourselves to these latter, intrinsic goods. But then what is an intrinsic good? Music, we should call such. We certainly value it for itself and not merely as a means to something else. But when we speak so, we do not refer to the music scored on a page or sound waves in a hall. We mean a musical experience. And I think we shall find on reflection that everything about which we are clear that it is intrinsically good is also an experience, a conscious experience. Happiness is a kind of experience. The health that we call good is either a state of the body, which is an instrumental good, or else if it is intrinsically good, it's a state of mind, subserved by a healthy body. When we speak of an education as good, we mean again the knowledge and wisdom that it should bring. Friendship lies in the experience of knowing friends. But granting that only experiences are intrinsically good, what is it about an experience that makes it so? Some have said, you remember that John Stuart Mill and Sidgwick said this, some have said the pleasure in it, the pleasure in the experience, and only that. Most of us are not inclined to take this very seriously. I sometimes think that the main argument for hedonism is that it was accepted by Henry Sidgwick, an argument of weight indeed, though somewhat less than decisive. Sidgwick is a great hero of mine. If you hear me talk more than once, you'll probably hear me mention his revered name. The reason for rejecting hedonism is very simple. It is that between two experiences, between which, as mere pleasure, we might find it hard to choose, for example, that of a drunken spree and that of at last understanding Finnegan's Wake, we do often find it easy to choose, which is not as it should be if pleasure alone counted. Nevertheless, on 2 points I find it impossible to disagree with a hedonist. The first is the obvious point that pleasure is a good and an intrinsic good. The second is more disputable, but perhaps more important. It is that every experience that is intrinsically good brings with it some degree of pleasure. The exceptions that leap to mind at once, experiences of pain bravely borne, of the fortitude of fireman or surgeon or PhD candidate, are cases of instrumental goods. Anyone who sought out these experiences for their own sake would be an eccentric. And as for the experiences of tragedy, of hard work, mental or physical, of the strenuous effort of sport, there is much genuine satisfaction in them, along with elements that taken alone would be evil. But if a man finds no pleasure at all in what he is experiencing, then it has no value for him. Suppose that the understanding of Joyce gave you not the slightest wisp of satisfaction, that it were a function of pure, unaffective intelligence, in which you took not the slightest interest, would the experience be valued as intrinsically worth having? John Stuart Mill went through an experience in his famous breakdown at 20, and he has left it on record that life without the power to enjoy was only a sapless cactus. Here he seems to me to be right. Pleasure, though not the good, is a component in all intrinsic goods. But now there is another character that's involved in all intrinsic goods. This is that of fulfilling impulse. A dinner is good because it quenches the elemental demands for hunger and thirst. A golf game is good because it fulfills at once our competitive interest in winning, our interest in pride and physical prowess, and probably our interest in being abroad in an attractive countryside. See, what I'm maintaining here is that in every experience that is intrinsically good, there are two aspects. First, the aspect of being pleasant, being pleasurable. I don't think there is such a thing as an intrinsically valuable experience that is negatively toned in respect to pleasure. And secondly, and more importantly, every intrinsically good experience is such because it fulfills some drive, impulse, urge of our nature. And the more fundamental the urge, the greater is the intrinsic good, I'd hold. The Fifth Symphony, which E.M. Foster has called the most sublime noise that ever penetrated the ear of man, is good because it fulfills an aesthetic need and impulse that in some people is among the most imperative demands of their nature. Without such interests or impulses, the experience would cease to be good. A dinner to a man already satiated has no goodness in it. There are many executives engrossed in other interests to whom the chasing of a little white ball about the countryside would seem mere lunacy. And to persons like Macaulay and Charles Lamb, Dean Inge and Prime Minister Asquith, who conspicuously lacked ears, the Fifth Symphony would have been martyrdom. William James has speculated on the values that the gorgeous art on the walls of the Vatican Gallery would have for a dog lost in its halls. The answer, of course, is none. And the reason is that there is nothing in its humble bosom to which these things can speak. It's apparently unstirred by any aesthetic impulse or needs. Some need, some natural demand, which an experience may fulfill, is the condition of that experience's being found good. I hold then that what makes an experience good is its possession of two components, the fulfillment of impulse and the feeling of satisfaction that normally attends such fulfillment. Of course, I don't expect this to go unprotested. There's an obvious objection to it. This is that when one calls a golf game or the Fifth Symphony good, I hope you don't mind my taking non-moral experiences of this kind as intrinsically good. I think every experience that has value is relevant to the goodness or badness of an act, because the rightness or wrongness of the act, because the rightness or wrongness depends upon the production of value, and that value can be of any kind whatever. Now, the objection is that when one looks into one's mind for any explicit reference to its being fulfilling or satisfying, one simply doesn't find it. I admit this. But the objection is less important than it seems. The point here is that when you say that something is good, you're not consciously or explicitly referring to these two aspects, which, in my view, make anything good. And I'm trying to answer that objection, which seems to me a very important one. The objection is less important than it seems, for it assumes that we cannot mean anything by our words that we cannot readily make explicit. If that's true, much of what is passed as philosophy has been curiously pointless. Socrates tried through 10 books of the Republic to run down what he meant by justice, and there are those who think that he barely got his hands on it at the end. What a waste of energy if the meaning really lay on the surface, ready to be picked up. Whatever we may think of the linguistic analysts, and I don't think too much of them, we must surely admit that their contention that the great little words of our language, such words as true, know, life, can, ought, though they give us no trouble if we ask no questions, are full of mystery and bafflement if we do. Now, good is one of these words. It's on our lips every day, and no one looks puzzled when we use it. We should never think of looking it up in a dictionary, and if we did, we should probably be quite content with the Oxford Dictionary's offering a term of general or indefinite commendation. But if this is all there is to the meaning, how did it become a battleground with such clear heads as Hume and Moore on opposite sides? The fact is that the term, like others just mentioned, has more than one kind of meaning. It has a common or current meaning that is definite enough for all ordinary purposes, but not for ethics. It also carries a penumbra of implicit meaning, which ethics must try to crystallize. When we say that a good experience means one that is fulfilling and satisfying, we are not suggesting that the plain man would come out with this as what he obviously meant. He would all too probably repudiate it. What we are contending is that if he hung on to his search in Socratic fashion until it yielded a meaning that covered consistently his applications of the term, which gave the intention required by its extension, he would find that only this would do. It is not his first meaning, but his last. Whatever you think of this view, it would clear up with grateful ease the old disputes about the objectivity of values and of value judgments. Some influential writers, Dean Inge and Nikolai Hartmann, for example, have held that values are eternal, that like the multiplication table, they loom over against all human apprehension of them as independent and timeless essences. This view, of course, we can't accept. Values are relative and dependent on the minds whose needs and impulses they fulfill. If some comet were to switch its tail of noxious gases over our planet tonight and asphyxiate all life upon it, would there be any value in the world tomorrow? I think not, unless indeed in some corner of the universe there are other creatures with needs and impulses that are in some measure fulfilled. To say, as some Aristotelians and Thomists do, that value lies in the achievement of form by matter, and that a rock on a lifeless planet has value to the extent that it realizes its rockness, conveys no meaning to me. When there is no consciousness, there is no value. Values in that sense are subjective. But then it is confusion to argue from this that value judgments are not objectively true. They are as true or false as any judgments in physics. If the golf game or the symphony does fulfill and satisfy the person who experiences it, then his experience is good. And the goodness of that experience is a fact, as objective, as little dependent on any judge's thinking or feeling about it as Gibraltar. The relativity of values to experience is wholly consistent with their independence of value judgments. Now I think I'll just chop this discourse off. I intended to go on with it and talk about the meaning of the term ought. But I think I've said enough disputable things already to, I hope, to provoke questions. So let me just stop at this point and ask you whether you do have any questions. Now, I've really made the following points. First, that we can't accept emotivism in ethics. Second, we can't accept deontology in ethics, Sir David Ross's position. Third, that we must accept a utilitarian position in this sense, that those acts, and only those acts, are objectively right, which, of all the acts open to us at the moment, produce the greatest good. I've gone on to say that what I mean by good is experience, and only experience, the conscious experience, not of human beings only, but of animals also, because they've risen to the dignity of pain, at least. And what makes an experience intrinsically good is two things. The fact that it fulfills one of our impulses, urges, or drives, and secondly, that in doing so, it naturally produces, as Aristotle indeed maintained, pleasure or happiness. There's my little ethical position in a nutshell. Now, what questions would you like to raise? Yes?
What kind of good does God or belief in God have for you in your view? Are you saying it just fulfills an urge or a need in people?
That's a very interesting and acute question. What do you mean when you say that God is good? Well, I think the person who says that is assuming that God is in some sense personal, that he has ends or objects or aims, very much as persons do, and that the good in his experience lies for him as for us in the fulfillment of these presumably enormous and incomprehensible aims or designs of his. Now, we assume that his actions are always right. Does rightness mean the same thing for him as it would for us? Well, I think we must assume so. That is, if he deliberately produced evil, which was avoidable, among his own creatures, we'd have to say that he was not, in our sense, doing right. I should myself accept that. That is, if you could just suppose that, well, here we come, of course, to the problem of evil. Let's suppose that we were convinced that an alternative faced the Creator himself, that he could have avoided the last two world wars, that he could have made people in such a way that they wouldn't experience the Black Death and cancer and so on, but that he deliberately chose to produce evils of that kind with no compensating or no equivalent good. Could we call him good in our sense? I don't think so. If we call him good, it is because at the back of our mind we assume that if he created these evils, as presumably he did, since he is the creator of all things, it must be that they serve an inscrutable purpose, which we haven't yet discovered.
Well, I gather from your point of view that we define good and that God, the concept of God into this.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's an important point, incidentally. I'm going to talk about that in my lecture tomorrow night, in passing. That is whether morals depends on religion or on theology. That is what we mean by a right action, this, obeying the will of God. There are some moralists of distinction, like Paley, who accepted that definition. I do not accept it. And I hope I'll have occasion tomorrow night to say something which will indicate the grounds why I can't accept that view. No, I think we start with our own notions of right and wrong, good and evil, and we fashion our view of God's goodness and badness in accordance with that idea. Are there further questions? Yes?
One of the objections that is commonly raised against Mill's brand of utilitarianism is that in order to assess the objective rightness of an action, it's necessary to be able to estimate the empirical factors.
Yes.
That is the consequences of this action.
Right.
Now, if it is the case in your revised brand of utilitarianism, if the objective rightness of an action depends upon its producing the greatest amount of good, considering the action not as an isolated action but as part of a whole network of actions, then I don't see how you can avoid the same problem as Mill, but rather it appears to be so much more difficult to assess the worth of an action on these grounds, because you have a much more complicated situation, and you still have empirical grounds as the
Yes.
moral arguments.
Well, how I agree with you. I think it is much more difficult than Mill assumed. And I'd go further than you do. I'd say that, I referred to Professor Pritchard, a former teacher of mine who was professor of moral philosophy at Oxford. He used to say that he doubted whether he'd ever done a right act. And he was confident that if he had done it, it was by accident. Now, I think you can see why a person could hold that view. Let's suppose that, you at this moment have an alternative. You just rise and walk out the door, if you wish to at this moment, or you can remain seated until the rest of the hour. Now, the universe is never going to be the same if you take one action rather than the other, because the results of that action are going to go on right down to the end of time. Perhaps that little action wouldn't make much difference, which one you did. But just take the question whether we should do what Senator Morse is recommending or what Dean Rusk is recommending in regard to Vietnam. Now that, of course, is a moral issue. The consequences of one decision or another would affect millions of people for centuries of time. You're suggesting that we never can unravel, we never can present to ourselves clearly all the consequences involved in one alternative or the other. That's perfectly true. That's why moral decisions are so frightfully difficult and so frightfully important. But the fact that we never can, with absolute certainty, exhaust the consequences doesn't relieve us from the responsibility of forecasting as completely and accurately as we can what the consequences are. Now, following out that question, it raises the question, doesn't it, whether if you are in a really difficult, tight moral position, whose advice it would be best to take. Suppose you're engaged to somebody, for example. You don't know whether to break the engagement or not. Now, that's the kind of decision that's really difficult. If you had a decision of that kind to make, would you call in Immanuel Kant to help you? Or would you call in somebody like Henry James? Or if Shakespeare were available, or his ghost, would you ask him? It'd be the latter kind of people. Why? Because they can envision the personal consequences involved. The pain or the exhilaration, the depression, the disappointment, the relief, all these things that happen in the minds of other people as a result of your decision. Now, to determine what it is right to do, you have to have the kind of personal imagination which enables you to enter into the experiences of other people. I think that the small boy who pulls the wings off flies is the sort of person who does what he does not because he's cruel, but just because he has no imagination. If you have other questions equally searching, I think I'd better either escape or else do my best to mobilize my wits in an adjoining room where I think we're going to go on,
yes,
aren't we?
We can move to Watson Lounge. I think there is a place in here. We Professor Blanshard, it was great to stay there for a little while. I think you'd like to rest and stay the next time. So thank you very much. Professor.
Yep.